Welcome to a journey through one of the most daring and heartbreaking episodes in American history. A night when 77 souls risked everything for a taste of freedom they had never known. I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time when you are listening to this narration, because what you are about to hear is not just a story from the past. It is a mirror reflecting the resilience of the human spirit against impossible odds. This is the story of the Pearl Escape, an audacious attempt in 1848 that shook the very foundation of Washington, D.C., a city that prided itself on being the capital of a free nation, while simultaneously hosting one of the largest slave markets in the country. Picture this. The night of April 15, 1848, the Potomac River black as ink, the only light coming from a sliver of moon barely visible through the clouds. The air is thick with tension, heavy with the kind of silence that precedes either triumph or disaster. Families are gathering in the shadows near the Southwest Wharf, their belongings wrapped in cloth bundles, their children clutching worn dolls and precious trinkets, unaware that they are about to embark on a voyage that will either deliver them to freedom or condemn them to a fate worse than the bondage they already know. These are not hardened criminals or revolutionaries. These are mothers, fathers, children, grandparents, people whose only crime is existing in a society that refuses to see them as human beings. They have heard whispers of a ship called the Pearl, a small schooner captained by a man named Daniel Drayton, a white abolitionist from the North, who has agreed to risk his own life to transport them down the Potomac, into the Chesapeake Bay, and eventually to freedom in the northern states. The plan is simple in theory, but nearly impossible in execution. The Pearl, a modest vessel barely 60 feet long, will secretly load these 77 enslaved individuals under the cover of darkness and sail them away from the nation's capital, slipping past patrols, informants, and the ever-watchful eyes of slave catchers who make their living hunting down runaways. Washington, D.C. in 1848 is a city of contradictions, where congressmen debate liberty and justice in marble halls, while enslaved people are bought and sold just blocks away, where the Declaration of Independence is revered as a sacred text, while human beings are treated as property, their lives valued only by the labor they can provide and the profit they can generate. The irony is not lost on the abolitionists who have been working in secret to organize this escape, nor is it lost on the enslaved people themselves, who have watched their owners celebrate freedom every 4th of July while denying them even the most basic human rights. Among the 77 are entire families, people who have made the agonizing decision to risk everything together rather than face separation, which is often the cruelest aspect of slavery. There is the Edmondson family, with 6 children ranging in age from childhood to young adulthood. Their mother Millie has saved every penny she could, hoping to one day purchase their freedom legally, but knowing that such a day may never come. There are young men who have been hired out to work in the city's hotels and shipyards, skilled laborers whose talents have enriched their enslavers but brought them no closer to autonomy. There are women who have served as domestics in the homes of politicians and merchants, women who have raised white children with more tenderness than those children's own mothers, women who have cooked meals and cleaned floors and mended clothes, all while dreaming of a life where their own children might grow up free. And there are elderly individuals, people who have survived decades of bondage, and now see this as perhaps their final opportunity to taste freedom before they die. The organizers of this escape have been planning for weeks, coordinating in whispers and coded messages, using the network of free black individuals and white abolitionists that will later be romanticized as the Underground Railroad, but is in reality a loose collection of brave souls willing to defy the law for the sake of human dignity. They have chosen the Pearl specifically because Captain Drayton is known to be sympathetic to the cause, and because the ship is small enough to avoid immediate suspicion, but large enough to carry the precious cargo.
The timing has been carefully selected to coincide with a period when many slave owners are distracted by social events and political gatherings, when the attention of the city is focused elsewhere, when the darkness of night can provide the cover they desperately need. As the families begin to board, the reality of what they are attempting sets in with crushing weight. Children are hushed by anxious parents, their small voices silenced not out of cruelty, but out of necessity, because a single cry could alert a passing patrol and doom them all. The elderly are helped aboard by younger hands, their joints stiff from years of hard labor, their movements slow but determined. Personal belongings are kept to an absolute minimum because space is limited and speed is essential. A favorite quilt, a Bible, a small wooden toy carved by a father's hand. These are the only physical connections to the lives they are leaving behind. The air smells of river water and fear, a combination that will haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. A scent that will forever be associated with this night of desperate hope. Captain Drayton watches from the helm, his face etched with concern and determination. He knows the risks, knows that if they are caught, he will face prison or worse. But he also knows that he cannot stand by and do nothing while human beings are treated as commodities. His crew is minimal, just a couple of trusted men who share his convictions, men who understand that they are participating in something that transcends the law, something that speaks to a higher moral calling.
The Pearl begins to move, the gentle lapping of water against the hull, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence that has settled over the vessel like a shroud. The families huddle together below deck, packed so tightly that breathing becomes a conscious effort, each inhale and exhale measured and controlled, to conserve the limited air available in the cramped space. Above them, Captain Drayton and his small crew work with practiced efficiency, adjusting the sails to catch what little wind is available on this still April night, navigating by instinct and experience through waters they know can be treacherous even in daylight. The Potomac stretches before them like a dark ribbon, promising escape, but also threatening discovery at every bend, every shallow crossing, every point where the river narrows and voices carry across the water with startling clarity. In the hold, Mary Edmondson clutches her younger sister Emily's hand, their palms slick with nervous perspiration despite the cool night air. Mary is 15 years old, Emily 13, and both girls have known nothing but slavery their entire lives. Yet they have been raised by parents who insisted on teaching them to read in secret, who whispered stories of freedom and dignity, who refused to let their spirits be completely broken by the system designed to destroy them. Their older siblings, Samuel and Richard, are positioned near the hatch, ready to help if problems arise, their young muscles tensed with a combination of fear and excitement that makes them feel simultaneously invincible and terribly vulnerable. Their parents, Paul and Millie Edmondson, are separated from them by several bodies, but their presence is felt nonetheless, a steady anchor in the chaos of this desperate gamble. Nearby, an elderly man named Augustus sits with his back against the wooden wall of the ship, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his eyes closed in what appears to be prayer, but is actually a meditation on the 73 years he has spent in bondage. He was born into slavery in 1775, the same year the American Revolution began, the same year white colonists started fighting for their own freedom from British rule, while simultaneously denying that same freedom to people who looked like him. He has survived the separation from his mother when he was 6 years old, sold to a different plantation because his original enslaver needed quick cash to pay gambling debts. He has survived the whip, the chain, the auction block, the soul-crushing humiliation of being inspected like livestock by potential buyers who squeezed his muscles and examined his teeth as if he were a horse. He has survived watching his own children sold away one by one, scattered across the South like seeds thrown carelessly into infertile soil. And now, in what may be the final chapter of his life, he is attempting something he never thought possible: escape. The ship glides past Alexandria, Virginia, a town whose prosperity is built largely on the slave trade, where auction houses operate openly and enslaved people are marched through the streets in chains.
where the smell of tobacco and cotton mingles with the stench of human misery. The passengers below deck are unaware of exactly where they are, but they can sense the passage of time by the subtle changes in the ship's movement, the way it responds to different currents, the occasional voices that drift across the water from the shore. Each sound brings a fresh wave of terror. Is it a patrol boat? Is it slave catchers who have somehow learned of their plan? Is it the beginning of the end they all fear but refuse to speak aloud? Captain Drayton knows they are making poor time. The wind that he had hoped would fill their sails and carry them swiftly down the river has failed to materialize, leaving them dependent on the current alone, which moves with agonizing slowness. He calculates and recalculates their position, estimating how many hours until dawn, how many miles they need to cover before the sun rises and their vessel becomes visible to anyone watching from the shore. His experience tells him they are falling behind schedule, that the margin for error is shrinking with each passing moment. But he says nothing to his crew, maintaining an outward calm that he does not truly feel. Below deck, a young mother named Sarah cradles her infant son against her chest, her hand covering his mouth gently but firmly, terrified that he will begin to cry and alert potential pursuers. The baby, barely 3 months old, seems to sense the gravity of the situation, his small body remaining still and quiet in a way that is almost supernatural. Sarah had debated whether to attempt this escape, knowing that traveling with an infant increased the risk for everyone, but the alternative was worse. Staying in bondage, watching her son grow up as property, seeing him eventually sold away from her as so many children are sold away from their mothers. She made a promise to herself the day he was born that she would do whatever necessary to give him a chance at freedom, even if that chance was impossibly small, even if the attempt might cost them both their lives. The hours crawl by with excruciating slowness. Some passengers sleep fitfully, their bodies exhausted from the physical and emotional strain of the day's preparations and the night's tension. Others remain wide awake, their minds racing with possibilities both hopeful and horrifying. They think about what life might be like in the North, where they have heard slavery is illegal, where black people can own property and educate their children and walk down the street without fear. But they also know these stories might be exaggerated, that freedom in the North may not be the paradise they imagine, that racism and discrimination exist everywhere, even in places where slavery has been abolished. Still, anything seems better than what they are leaving behind, any uncertainty preferable to the absolute certainty of remaining enslaved. Dawn approaches with the inevitability of fate, the sky gradually lightening from black to deep blue to pale gray, the stars fading one by one as if abandoning the escapees to their destiny.
The first rays of sunlight pierce through the clouds, like accusing fingers, illuminating the Pearl in ways that Captain Drayton had desperately hoped to avoid. They are still in the Potomac, still dangerously close to Washington, still within easy reach of anyone who might be searching for them. The captain's worst fears are materializing before his eyes as he realizes they have traveled perhaps 30 miles at most, a fraction of the distance they needed to cover under the protective cloak of darkness. The wind remains stubbornly absent, the sails hanging limp and useless, mocking their desperate need for speed. He orders his crew to consider their options, his voice low and urgent, knowing that every moment they remain visible in daylight increases the likelihood of discovery exponentially. Back in Washington, the absence of 77 enslaved people has not gone unnoticed. The morning brings a cascade of discoveries as enslavers wake to find their property missing, their carefully maintained systems of control suddenly shattered by this mass defection. The news spreads through the city with remarkable speed, carried from house to house by servants, messengers, and the enslaved people who remained behind, some out of fear, some out of loyalty, some because they were simply not included in the escape plan. The reaction is immediate and volcanic, a mixture of rage, humiliation, and genuine shock that so many people could vanish in a single night without anyone raising an alarm. This is not a handful of runaways, not the occasional desperate individual fleeing alone into the night. This is an organized exodus, a coordinated rebellion that strikes at the very heart of the institution that Washington's elite holds so dear. The enslavers gather in urgent meetings, their faces red with fury, their voices raised in demands for immediate action. Among them are prominent citizens, men who serve in Congress, men who preach about law and order while profiting from human bondage,
men whose wealth and status depend entirely on the labor they extract from people they refuse to acknowledge as fully human. They pool their resources quickly, offering substantial rewards for information leading to the capture of the escapees, posting notices throughout the city and surrounding areas, mobilizing every resource available to them. The sum they collectively pledge is staggering, enough to tempt even those who might otherwise be sympathetic to the cause of freedom, enough to turn neighbors into informants and friends into betrayers. A steamboat named the Salem is commandeered for the pursuit, its powerful engines capable of speeds that the wind-dependent Pearl cannot hope to match. The vessel is loaded with an armed posse, men carrying rifles and pistols, men whose livelihoods depend on maintaining the system of slavery, men who view the escapees not as human beings seeking freedom, but as stolen property that must be recovered at any cost. The captain of the Salem is given simple instructions: find the Pearl, intercept it before it reaches free territory, and return the cargo to its rightful owners. The word cargo is used deliberately, a linguistic choice that reveals everything about how these pursuers view the people they are hunting. The Salem churns down the Potomac with frightening efficiency, its paddle wheels cutting through the water, its smokestack billowing black clouds that can be seen for miles. On board, the posse members check their weapons and share stories of previous slave captures, their voices animated with the thrill of the hunt, treating this pursuit as sport rather than the life-and-death struggle it truly represents. Some of them are professional slave catchers, men who have made careers out of tracking down runaways and returning them to bondage, men who have developed a sixth sense for predicting where desperate people might flee. Others are simply citizens who have been swept up in the collective hysteria, men who see this as an opportunity to demonstrate their loyalty to the system that privileges them, men who would never question whether what they are doing is morally defensible. On the Pearl, Captain Drayton spots the smoke from the Salem long before the steamboat itself comes into view. His heart sinks as he realizes what this means, as he calculates the impossible mathematics of their situation. The Pearl cannot outrun a steamboat, cannot hide in waters that are becoming increasingly busy with commercial traffic, cannot simply disappear when they are so obviously visible in the harsh light of day. He gathers his small crew and explains their options, which are limited and grim. They can attempt to beach the ship and scatter, hoping that at least some of the passengers might escape into the Maryland countryside, but this would likely result in chaos and probable death for many, especially the elderly and the children. They can attempt to fight, though they are vastly outnumbered and outgunned, a suicidal gesture that would accomplish nothing except adding more tragedy to an already tragic situation. Or they can surrender, hoping that cooperation might result in some measure of mercy, though past experience suggests that mercy is not something enslavers are known for extending to runaways. Below deck, the passengers sense that something has changed, that the atmosphere has shifted from tense hope to something darker and more desperate. Whispers circulate, questions are asked in hushed tones, and gradually the truth spreads through the cramped space like a contagion. They have been discovered, they are being pursued, their bid for freedom is collapsing around them. Some respond with tears, the reality of their situation finally breaking through the emotional barriers they had constructed to get through the night. Others respond with anger, cursing the luck that denied them the wind they needed, cursing the society that forces people to such desperate measures, cursing themselves for daring to hope that escape was possible. And some respond with an eerie calm, an acceptance born from lives spent navigating disappointment and crushed dreams, a resilience that refuses to be completely extinguished even in the face of certain defeat. Mary Edmondson holds her sister Emily tighter, whispering promises she knows she cannot keep, telling her that everything will be all right, even as she feels the weight of their failure settling over them like a suffocating blanket.
The Salem closes the distance with ruthless efficiency, its steam engine roaring like some mechanical beast, its wake spreading across the Potomac in widening circles that seem to symbolize the inescapable reach of the system the escapees had dared to challenge. Captain Drayton makes the only decision available to him, ordering his crew to lower the sails and surrender, knowing that resistance would be futile and would only result in bloodshed that would serve no purpose except to satisfy the bloodlust of their pursuers. The Pearl slows to a stop, bobbing gently in the current, a small and fragile vessel, now surrounded by the overwhelming force of the Salem and its cargo of armed men, whose faces reveal a mixture of triumph and rage. The boarding is brutal and efficient. The posse members swarm onto the Pearl with weapons drawn, shouting orders and threats, their voices harsh and dehumanizing as they begin the process of securing their recovered property. Captain Drayton and his crew are immediately restrained, their hands bound with rope, their bodies searched for weapons or anything that might be used as evidence in the trials that will inevitably follow. The captain maintains his dignity, even as he is roughly handled, his face set in an expression of defiant resignation, refusing to show regret for an action he believes was morally justified,
even if legally indefensible. He knows what awaits him: imprisonment, certainly, possibly worse, his name forever marked in the records as someone who violated one of the most sacred laws in the slaveholding South. The passengers are ordered up from below deck, blinking in the harsh sunlight that seems to mock their dreams of freedom, their faces showing the full spectrum of human emotion, from terror to despair to stubborn defiance. The posse members process them with cold efficiency, counting heads to ensure that all 77 are accounted for, checking them against lists provided by the enslavers, treating them with less consideration than one might show to livestock being loaded for market. Children cling to their parents, elderly individuals struggle to climb the steep steps from the hold, women attempt to maintain some shred of dignity, even as they are prodded and examined by men whose eyes reveal nothing but contempt and a perverse satisfaction at having prevented their escape. Augustus, the elderly man who had spent 73 years in bondage, stands on the deck of the Pearl with his eyes fixed on the Maryland shore, so close and yet impossibly distant, a shoreline that represents everything he had hoped for and everything he will now never experience. His weathered face shows no tears, no obvious signs of emotion, but those who look closely can see the subtle trembling in his hands, the slight slump in shoulders that had been straight with hope just hours before. He had known this was possible, had understood the risks when he agreed to join the escape attempt, but knowing something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally are entirely different things. He wonders, in this moment of crushing defeat, whether it would have been better never to have tried, never to have tasted even a few hours of hope, never to have allowed himself to imagine what freedom might feel like. Sarah, the young mother with the infant son, clutches her baby so tightly that he finally begins to cry, his small voice breaking through the tense silence that has settled over the captured vessel. One of the posse members barks at her to quiet the child, his tone suggesting that he views the infant's distress as an inconvenience rather than the natural response of a frightened baby to a terrifying situation. Sarah rocks her son and whispers soothing sounds, her own fear pushed aside by the maternal instinct to protect and comfort, even when comfort seems impossible. She thinks about the promise she made to herself, the vow that she would give her son a chance at freedom, and she feels the bitter sting of failure in a way that cuts deeper than any physical pain she has ever experienced. The journey back to Washington is a nightmare made manifest. The 77 escapees are transferred to the Salem, crowded together under guard, their earlier hope transformed into dread about what awaits them upon their return. They know that punishment is inevitable, that enslavers will want to make an example of them to discourage future escape attempts, that the price for their audacity will be extracted from their bodies and spirits. Some have heard stories of runaways being whipped until their backs are ribbons of torn flesh, of families being deliberately separated and sold to distant locations as punishment for attempted escape, of individuals being subjected to tortures designed to break not just their bodies but their will to ever resist again. The Salem makes its way back up the Potomac, retracing the route that had seemed so promising just hours before, passing landmarks that now feel like monuments to crushed dreams. The passengers stand or sit in silence, each lost in private thoughts about what might have been, about the cruel twist of fate that denied them the wind they needed, about the informants who may have betrayed their plans, about the future that now looms before them with renewed bleakness. The Edmondson children huddle together, their parents nearby but unable to offer much comfort beyond their physical presence, all of them knowing that their family may be torn apart as punishment for this attempted escape. As Washington comes into view, the reality of their situation becomes undeniable. They can see the familiar landmarks of the city, the buildings where they have worked, the streets they have walked, the auction blocks where they or people they know have been sold like commodities. But now everything looks different, more oppressive, more threatening, charged with the knowledge of what is about to happen. Word of the Pearl's capture has already reached the city, and crowds are gathering at the wharf, a mob of enslavers and their supporters. People eager to witness the return of the runaways. People whose faces show a disturbing mixture of satisfaction and anticipation of the punishment that will follow. The Salem docks amid shouts and jeers from the assembled crowd, voices calling out insults and threats, hands pointing accusingly at the prisoners who represent such a profound challenge to the established order.
The disembarkation is orchestrated as a public spectacle, a deliberate display of power designed to reinforce the social hierarchy that the escape attempt had threatened to undermine. The 77 are marched off the Salem in a procession that feels choreographed for maximum humiliation, forced to walk through a gauntlet of angry faces and hostile voices, their heads forced down by the guards who prod them along with rough hands and rougher words. The crowd presses close, some spitting, some shouting accusations, some simply staring with the kind of cold curiosity one might direct at exotic animals in a menagerie. Children in the crowd point and ask questions of their parents, receiving answers that paint the escapees as criminals and ingrates, dangerous elements that must be controlled and punished to maintain the proper functioning of society. The enslavers are waiting at the wharf, positioned like judges at a tribunal, their faces revealing the complex mixture of emotions that comes from having one's property returned after believing it might be lost forever. There is relief, certainly, because each of these 77 individuals represents significant financial investment, wealth measured in human flesh and human labor, assets that have been recovered before they could depreciate through escape. But there is also fury, a deep and abiding rage at the audacity of people they consider inferior, daring to assert autonomy, daring to claim ownership of their own bodies and destinies, daring to challenge a system that has existed for generations and that many white Southerners view as divinely ordained and economically essential. The sorting begins immediately, enslavers stepping forward to claim their property, examining the returned individuals for signs of injury or illness that might affect their value, treating them with the same detached scrutiny one might apply to inspecting a horse or a piece of furniture that has been temporarily misplaced. The Edmondson family is identified and separated from the larger group, their enslaver, a man named Hamilton, who owns a substantial estate just outside Washington, and who views this escape attempt as a personal betrayal by people he believed were content with their condition. His face is red with indignation as he counts his returned property, ensuring that all 6 children and both parents are present and accounted for, his lips moving silently as he calculates the potential loss he has avoided and the punishment he will inflict to ensure such defiance never happens again. Paul Edmondson, the father, stands straight despite the exhaustion and fear, his eyes meeting Hamilton's gaze with a quiet dignity that seems to infuriate the enslaver even more than the escape attempt itself. There is something in Paul's bearing that refuses to accept the fundamental premise of slavery, something that insists on his humanity even when everything around him denies it, something that will not be broken even by the certain knowledge of the punishment that awaits. Millie Edmondson, his wife, positions herself between Hamilton and her daughters, a futile gesture of protection, but one that speaks to maternal instinct that transcends the brutal realities of their situation. She has spent years saving pennies in the hope of purchasing her children's freedom legally, years of patient accumulation that now seem wasted, years of hope that have been crushed in a single night of failed escape. Augustus, the elderly man who had survived 73 years of bondage, is claimed by an enslaver named Thornton, who seems less angry than disappointed, as if a favored dog had run away rather than a human being had sought freedom. Thornton is one of the old guard, a man who prides himself as a benevolent master, who provides adequate food and shelter, and who rarely resorts to physical punishment, who genuinely believes that his enslaved people should be grateful for his kindness, and that Augustus's participation in the escape represents an incomprehensible ingratitude. He looks at Augustus with genuine puzzlement, asking questions that Augustus knows are not meant to be answered, questions about what more he could have wanted, what more he could have needed, why he would risk everything for something as abstract as freedom, when he already had security and predictability in his bondage. Sarah and her infant son are claimed by a woman named Mrs. Carlyle, a widow who inherited her enslaved people from her late husband, and who maintains the institution more out of economic necessity than philosophical commitment. Mrs. Carlyle's face shows genuine distress as she examines Sarah and the baby, not because she sympathizes with their desire for freedom, but because she fears they may have been damaged by the experience, that Sarah's value as a domestic servant might be diminished if she has become rebellious or untrustworthy, that the infant might have suffered harm during the escape attempt that would reduce his future value. She questioned Sarah with the tone of someone trying to assess damage to a valuable possession, asking about the baby's health, about whether Sarah had been coerced into joining the escape or had gone willingly, clearly hoping to hear that it was coercion because that would absolve her of any need to question Sarah's loyalty or her own practices as an enslaver. The process continues for hours, each of the 77 being identified and claimed, sorted and catalogued, returned to the people who claim legal ownership of their bodies and labor. Some of the enslavers are relatively calm, viewing this as an unfortunate incident that requires measured response to prevent recurrence. Others are openly vengeful, already discussing the punishments they will inflict, the examples they will make, the ways they will ensure that their property never again attempts such dangerous defiance. The conversations between enslavers reveal the economic calculations that underlie their fury, the cost of organizing the pursuit, the potential loss if the escape had succeeded, the need to demonstrate to other enslaved people that escape is impossible, and that attempts will be punished with such severity that the risk becomes unthinkable. Captain Drayton and his crew are kept separate from the recaptured escapees, held under heavy guard while authorities decide what charges to bring and what courts have jurisdiction over their alleged crimes. The legal proceedings against Captain Drayton and his crew begin swiftly, driven by a prosecutorial zeal that reflects the threat the Pearl incident represents to the entire institution of slavery. The charges are numerous and severe: theft of property, conspiracy to deprive slaveholders of their legal possessions, violation of the Fugitive Slave Act, and a litany of other offenses that carry substantial prison sentences. The courtroom becomes a theater where competing visions of America clash in ways both explicit and subtle, where the language of property rights and states' rights is deployed to defend an institution that reduces human beings to commodities, where legal arguments are constructed on foundations that deliberately ignore the fundamental humanity of the people at the center of the controversy. The prosecution presents its case with confidence born from knowing that the law is entirely on their side, that every statute, every precedent, every established principle of jurisprudence in the slave states supports their position. They parade witnesses who testify to the financial losses suffered by the enslavers, who describe the chaos and distress caused by the mass disappearance, who paint Drayton as a dangerous radical whose actions threatened the social fabric of Washington and, by extension, the entire South. The prosecutors speak in lofty terms about the sanctity of property rights, about the need to maintain order and respect for law, about the dangerous precedent that would be set if people like Drayton were allowed to violate the established legal framework with impunity. They carefully avoid discussing the morality of slavery itself, focusing instead on the legality of Drayton's actions, creating a rhetorical framework where the question is not whether slavery is right, but whether Drayton had the right to interfere with it. Drayton's defense is handicapped from the start by the simple fact that he cannot deny what he did, cannot claim ignorance of the law he violated, cannot appeal to any legal principle that would justify his actions within the existing framework of American jurisprudence. His lawyers attempt to argue for leniency based on his motivations, suggesting that he acted out of humanitarian concern rather than criminal intent, but this argument finds little sympathy in a courtroom where the judge and most of the spectators are themselves slaveholders or supporters of the institution. The defense tries to introduce testimony about the conditions of slavery, about the reasons why 77 people would risk everything for freedom, but these attempts are repeatedly blocked by the prosecution and sustained by a judge who makes clear that the morality of slavery is not on trial, only Drayton's violation of property law. The trial becomes a spectacle that draws attention far beyond Washington, with newspapers across the country reporting on the proceedings in ways that reveal the deep divisions threatening to tear the nation apart. Northern abolitionist papers lionize Drayton as a hero, a man of principle who acted according to a higher moral law even when it meant violating the unjust laws of man, a modern-day embodiment of the Underground Railroad's most courageous conductors. They publish editorial after editorial condemning not Drayton but the system that made his actions necessary, pointing out the profound hypocrisy of a nation founded on principles of liberty and equality that simultaneously enslaves millions based on nothing more than the color of their skin. They raise funds for Drayton's defense and publish letters from prominent abolitionists including Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, men who see the Pearl Incident as a rallying point for the anti-slavery movement. Southern newspapers take the opposite position with equal fervor, portraying Drayton as a criminal and a fanatic, a dangerous agitator whose actions represent everything wrong with Northern interference in Southern affairs. They publish editorials warning that if such behavior is tolerated or glorified, it will lead to chaos and possibly armed conflict, that the stability of the entire republic depends on maintaining the constitutional compromises that allow slavery to exist in states where the population desires it. They argue that Northerners who have never lived in slave states, who have never managed large agricultural operations dependent on enslaved labor, have no right to impose their moral judgments on Southern society, that slavery is a complex institution that outsiders cannot understand, that the enslaved people themselves are often content with their situation and are only stirred to discontent by outside agitators like Drayton. The verdict is never in doubt. Captain Drayton is found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced to substantial prison time, though he avoids the death penalty that some prosecutors had sought. His crew members receive similar sentences, their futures destroyed by their participation in an act they believed was morally necessary but legally indefensible. The sentencing hearing becomes another opportunity for speeches and moral pronouncements, with the judge delivering a lengthy statement about the importance of respecting property rights and maintaining social order, about the dangers posed by those who would put their personal moral judgments above the law of the land, about the need to send a clear message that such actions will not be tolerated regardless of the motivations behind them. But while Drayton's fate is being decided in the courtroom, the fate of the 77 recaptured escapees is being decided in more private venues, in the homes and offices of their enslavers, in conversations that treat human destiny as a business decision requiring careful calculation of costs and benefits. The question facing each enslaver is what to do with property that has proven itself dangerous, that has demonstrated a willingness to risk everything for freedom, that can no longer be trusted to accept bondage without resistance. The answers vary depending on individual circumstances, personal temperaments, and economic calculations, but they all share a common thread: the need to re-establish control, to demonstrate that the attempt to escape has made the escapees' situations worse rather than better, to ensure that no one else gets similar ideas. Some enslavers opt for immediate physical punishment, public whippings designed to inflict pain and humiliation in equal measure, spectacles intended to serve as warnings to other enslaved people about the consequences of defiance. Others choose economic punishment, selling the ringleaders or the most troublesome individuals to traders who will transport them to the Deep South, to the cotton and sugar plantations of Mississippi and Louisiana, where conditions are notoriously brutal and where distance makes any future escape attempt virtually impossible. The Edmondson family faces perhaps the cruelest fate of all, one that transforms Hamilton's rage into calculated financial opportunity disguised as punishment. Rather than keeping the family together and simply subjecting them to increased surveillance and harsher working conditions, they deliberately separate this family that dared to seek freedom together, scattering them across the South in a way that ensures they will likely never see each other again, turning their love for one another into a source of lifelong anguish rather than strength. This is punishment that transcends the physical, that attacks the emotional and psychological bonds that make people human, that uses affection as a weapon to inflict maximum suffering. The decision is announced to the family with bureaucratic coldness, Hamilton explaining his reasoning as if discussing the disposition of problematic livestock rather than the destruction of a family unit. Paul and Millie Edmondson, the parents who had scrimped and saved for years hoping to purchase their children's freedom, are told they will remain on Hamilton's estate because their age makes them less valuable on the open market, and because keeping them serves as a constant reminder to other enslaved people of the consequences of defiance. But their children, ranging from young Mary and Emily to their older siblings Samuel and Richard, are to be sold immediately to a slave trader named Hope Slatter, a man whose reputation is well known throughout the region, a man who specializes in purchasing enslaved people in the Upper South and transporting them to the Deep South, where demand and prices are higher. The girls, Mary and Emily Edmondson, are particularly valuable to Slatter because of their light skin and their education, qualities that make them suitable for the domestic slave trade that supplies wealthy households with servants, or worse, for the notorious fancy trade that caters to the sexual appetites of wealthy white men who purchase young women of mixed race specifically for exploitation. Slatter examines the girls with the cold assessment of a jeweler evaluating precious stones, noting their features, their bearing, their apparent intelligence, calculating the prices he can command in the markets of New Orleans or Charleston, where such attributes are prized, and where the distance from their family will make resistance more difficult and escape virtually impossible. Paul Edmondson watches this transaction with eyes that reveal a grief so profound, it seems to age him decades in moments, his hands clenching and unclenching helplessly at his sides, his body radiating a tension born from the conflict between paternal instinct and the enforced helplessness of his position. Millie weeps openly, her sobs filling the room where this business is being conducted, her pleas for mercy falling on ears that have learned to be deaf to such appeals, her maternal anguish treated as an inconvenience rather than a legitimate expression of human emotion. The children themselves seem frozen, unable to fully process what is happening, their faces showing confusion that will eventually transform into understanding, and then into the kind of trauma that marks people for life. The separation occurs over several days, a drawn-out torture that allows each family member to fully comprehend what they are losing. Mary and Emily are taken first, loaded onto Slatter's wagon along with other enslaved people he has recently purchased, their last view of their parents being Millie's collapsed form being supported by Paul, both of them watching their daughters disappear down the road toward an uncertain future that fills them with dread they cannot even articulate. The girls clutch each other's hands through the bars of the wagon, their earlier sophistication and education suddenly meaning nothing in the face of this brutal reality, their ability to read and write and think critically providing no protection against the system that views them as commodities to be bought and sold at will. Samuel and Richard, the older brothers who had positioned themselves near the hatch on the Pearl ready to help if problems arose, are sold separately to different traders, their physical strength making them valuable for plantation labor in the expanding cotton fields of Alabama and Mississippi. The brothers who have been inseparable since childhood, who have protected each other through countless difficulties, who have shared dreams of freedom that now seem like cruel jokes, are forced to say goodbye, knowing they will almost certainly never see each other again. Their parting is silent, neither able to find words adequate to the moment, their final embrace lasting until they are physically separated by the traders who have purchased them, and who view such emotional displays as wasted time that delays their departure. Augustus, the 73-year-old man who had hoped to taste freedom before he died, finds himself in a different kind of hell. His enslaver Thornton, still puzzled by what he views as incomprehensible ingratitude, decides against selling him because his age makes him nearly worthless on the open market. Instead, Thornton opts for a punishment that is psychological rather than economic. Augustus is to be kept on the estate but isolated from the other enslaved people, forbidden from speaking with them,
required to work alone under constant supervision, denied even the small comforts of community and companionship that make bondage slightly more bearable. It is a sentence of social death, turning his remaining years into a prolonged solitary confinement, where he must live among people he cannot connect with, where every day serves as a reminder of his failed escape and his continued powerlessness. Sarah, the young mother who had risked everything for her infant son, faces a choice that is really no choice at all. Mrs. Carlyle, her enslaver, offers what she presents as mercy. Sarah can remain in her household and continue her work as a domestic servant, only if she agrees never to attempt escape again, only if she accepts increased restrictions on her movements and activities, only if she acknowledges that her attempt to flee was wrong and deserving of punishment. The alternative, Mrs. Carlyle makes clear, is to be sold along with her son to a trader who will take them south, where mother and child might eventually be separated when the boy is old enough to work and valuable enough to sell independently.
Sarah accepts Mrs. Carlyle's terms with the bitter understanding that she has no real choice, that the illusion of agency being offered is itself a form of cruelty, a way of making her complicit in her own continued bondage. She holds her son close as she makes this forced agreement, whispering promises to him that she knows may be impossible to keep, telling him that she will find a way to give him a better life, even though every avenue toward that goal seems blocked by the system that owns them both. Mrs. Carlyle watches this scene with an expression that mingles satisfaction and something that might be mistaken for sympathy, but is really just relief that her property has been secured without the inconvenience and expense of having to replace it. The broader impact of the Pearl incident ripples outward through Washington and beyond, touching lives and shaping debates in ways that extend far past the immediate fate of the 77 individuals who attempted escape. The free black community of Washington, which had provided support and assistance to the escape plan, finds itself under increased scrutiny and suspicion, subjected to harassment by authorities who assume that any free black person must be potentially involved in helping enslaved people escape. New ordinances are passed restricting the movements and activities of free black residents, requiring them to carry papers proving their status at all times, imposing curfews and limitations on assembly that make their nominal freedom feel increasingly tenuous and conditional. The Pearl incident becomes ammunition in the intensifying national debate over slavery, cited by both sides as evidence for their competing visions of America's future. Abolitionists point to the 77 as proof that enslaved people desire freedom and will risk everything to obtain it, that the institution cannot be maintained with constant violence and surveillance, that a system requiring such brutal enforcement of submission cannot possibly be moral or sustainable. They organize rallies and petition drives, publish pamphlets and newspaper articles, use the story of the Pearl to recruit new supporters to the anti-slavery cause and to raise funds for continued resistance efforts. The names of the Edmondson sisters in particular become rallying cries, their youth and education making them sympathetic figures whose sail into the Deep South represents everything that is wrong with an institution that treats human beings as property. Pro-slavery advocates respond with equal vigor, arguing that the Pearl incident demonstrates the dangerous influence of Northern agitators and the need for stronger laws protecting property rights in enslaved people. They point to Drayton's conviction as proof that the legal system works, that troublemakers will be punished, that the institution of slavery rests on solid legal and constitutional foundations that cannot be used to abstract moral principles. They argue that the attempt itself proves that enslaved people cannot be trusted with freedom, that they require the structure and discipline that slavery provides, that the 77 who attempted escape were led astray by outside influences, rather than acting on any genuine desire for autonomy. The logical contradictions in these arguments, the ways they simultaneously claim that enslaved people are content and that they require constant supervision to prevent escape, seem to escape notice among those making such claims. In the months following the recapture, stories begin to circulate about the fates of individual escapees, fragmentary reports that make their way back to Washington through the networks of enslaved and free black people who maintain connections across vast distances, despite the efforts of enslavers to prevent communication. There are rumors that Mary and Emily Edmondson have been purchased by a minister in New Orleans who recognizes their education and has put them to work teaching the children of his household, a situation that, while still bondage, is far better than the alternatives they might have faced. These rumors give Paul and Millie Edmondson a small measure of hope, something to cling to during the long days and longer nights when they wonder what has become of their children,
whether they are being treated humanely, whether they remember their parents and siblings, or have been forced to forget in order to survive. Other stories are darker, whispered accounts of escapees who died during the journey south, unable to survive the harsh conditions of the slave coffles that march human cargo hundreds of miles in chains, or who were sold to particularly brutal masters on isolated plantations where their defiance is beaten out of them through systematic violence. These stories circulate as warnings and as laments, reminding everyone who hears them of the terrible price that can be exacted for daring to seek freedom, reinforcing the psychological chains that often prove more effective than physical restraints in maintaining the institution of slavery. The uncertainty may be worse than confirmed bad news, because it leaves room for imagination to conjure endless scenarios, each more terrible than the last, each feeding the grief and guilt of those left behind. Augusta survives in his imposed isolation, but those who occasionally glimpse him working alone note that something fundamental has changed in his bearing. The quiet dignity that had characterized him before the escape attempt has been replaced by a kind of hollow resignation, as if some essential spark has been extinguished. He performs his assigned tasks with mechanical efficiency, but without any engagement, moving through his days like a ghost inhabiting a body, rather than a living person experiencing life. His fellow enslaved people, forbidden from speaking with him directly, find ways to leave small offerings where he will find them, a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth, a small stone that might serve as a reminder that he is not entirely forgotten, tiny gestures of solidarity that cannot undo the punishment, but that at least acknowledge his continued humanity. Captain Drayton begins serving his sentence in a Washington jail, his cell becoming an unlikely pilgrimage site for abolitionists who visit to express their support and admiration, who smuggle in letters and newspapers, who ensure that his sacrifice is not forgotten by the movement he served. He maintains his conviction that what he did was right even in the face of imprisonment, writing letters that are published in abolitionist newspapers, providing detailed accounts of the Pearl incident that serve as both historical record and propaganda tool.
Drayton's imprisonment becomes a cause célèbre in abolitionist circles, with prominent figures like Charles Sumner and Salmon Chase using their political influence to argue for his pardon or at least the reduction of his sentence. They frame his case not just as a matter of individual justice, but as a test of whether the North will stand behind those who act on their anti-slavery principles, whether the federal government will continue to prioritize property rights in human beings over basic moral considerations, whether the compromises that have held the Union together can survive the increasing polarization over slavery. Their efforts are partially successful, though it takes years of lobbying and political maneuvering before Drayton is finally pardoned and released, his health permanently damaged by his time in prison, but his resolve unshaken by the ordeal. The long-term consequences of the Pearl incident extend far beyond the immediate participants, influencing the trajectory of American politics in ways that become clear only in retrospect. The episode hardens positions on both sides of the slavery debate, making compromise increasingly difficult as each side sees in the incident confirmation of their existing beliefs. Abolitionists become more convinced that slavery cannot be reformed but must be abolished entirely, that any institution requiring such brutal enforcement mechanisms is irredeemable, that gradualist approaches are inadequate to address a moral evil of such magnitude. Pro-slavery advocates become more defensive and aggressive, seeing in every Northern criticism and attack on their way of life, interpreting every attempt to help enslaved people escape as evidence of a broader conspiracy to destroy Southern society, retreating further into ideological positions that make peaceful resolution increasingly unlikely. The Fugitive Slave Act, which had already been controversial, becomes even more contentious in the wake of the Pearl incident, with Northern states increasingly reluctant to cooperate with its enforcement, and Southern states increasingly insistent that the federal government must do more to protect their property interests. The debates in Congress grow more heated, with representatives from slave states and free states barely able to maintain the veneer of civility, with physical altercations becoming more common as tempers flare and positions harden. The Pearl is mentioned repeatedly in these debates, cited as evidence by both sides, its story transformed from a specific incident involving specific people into a symbol representing broader conflicts about the nature of freedom, property, and justice in America. In Washington itself, the Pearl incident leaves lasting scars on the enslaved community. The increased surveillance and restrictions make future escape attempts more difficult, but they also create an atmosphere of simmering resentment that never fully dissipates. Enslaved people who had nothing to do with the Pearl find themselves subjected to harsher oversight, their movements more restricted, their activities more closely monitored, their lives more constrained by a system that has been reminded of its own vulnerability.
The free black population faces similar challenges, finding that their precarious status has become even more precarious, that their rights and freedoms can be curtailed at any moment based on the suspicions or convenience of the white authorities who control the city. Yet despite all the suffering and failure, despite the terrible price paid by the 77 and their families, the Pearl incident also serves as inspiration for future resistance. The very fact that 77 people could coordinate an escape attempt in the heart of the nation's capital, that they could come within hours of success, that they could force the system to reveal its brutal mechanisms of control, all of this becomes part of the oral tradition passed down among enslaved people, a story of courage if not success, a reminder that resistance is possible even when victory is not guaranteed. The names of the participants, especially the Edmondson family, are remembered and honored in ways that their enslavers could never have anticipated, their attempted escape becoming part of a larger narrative of struggle that will eventually contribute to slavery's downfall. The abolitionist movement gains new energy from the Pearl incident, using the stories of the 77 to humanize the abstract debates about slavery, to put faces and names to the statistics and philosophical arguments, to make Northern audiences understand the human cost of the compromises their politicians have made. Frederick Douglass, himself an escaped slave who has become one of the movement's most powerful voices, speaks frequently about the Pearl in his lectures, using it to illustrate the desperate desire for freedom that drives people to risk everything, the cruelty of a system that punishes such desire with family separation and violence, the moral bankruptcy of a nation that claims to value liberty while denying it to millions. His audiences are moved to tears and to action, contributing money to help purchase the freedom of those who were sold south, signing petitions demanding the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia, joining the growing chorus of voices calling for fundamental change. Harriet Beecher Stowe, working on the novel that will become Uncle Tom's Cabin, incorporates elements inspired by the Pearl incident into her narrative, recognizing the power of specific stories to move hearts and change minds in ways that abstract arguments cannot. The character of Eliza crossing the ice to escape with her child, one of the novel's most memorable scenes, echoes the desperation of the Pearl's passengers, their willingness to risk death rather than remaining bondage. When Stowe's novel is published in 1852, it becomes a sensation, selling hundreds of thousands of copies, turning millions of Northern readers into anti-slavery advocates, proving that the stories of people like the 77 can indeed change the course of history, even when the immediate outcomes seem to be nothing but defeat and suffering. The Edmondson sisters, Mary and Emily, eventually become the beneficiaries of a remarkable abolitionist fundraising campaign that raises enough money to purchase their freedom from the trader who had taken them south. They return to the North as free women, their story of survival and eventual liberation becoming a powerful testimony to the possibility of redemption even in the darkest circumstances. They tour with abolitionists, speaking at gatherings where their education and articulation serve as living proof that enslaved people are fully human, fully capable, fully deserving of the rights and freedoms that white Americans take for granted.
Their testimonies at these abolitionist gatherings carry a weight that no second-hand account could match. Their presence on stage undermining every racist assumption about the intellectual inferiority of black people. Their eloquence challenging the comfortable narratives that allow slavery to persist. Mary and Emily speak about their experiences with a combination of grace and directness that captivates audiences, describing the night of the escape attempt, the terror of recapture, the anguish of separation from their family, the degradation of being examined and sold like livestock, the long uncertainty about whether they would ever be free. They do not spare their listeners the harsh details, understanding that comfortable white Northerners need to be confronted with the reality of slavery, rather than allowed to maintain comforting illusions about the institution being somehow benevolent or necessary. The sisters also speak about education, about how their parents had risked punishment to ensure they could read and write, about how this education had both helped them survive their ordeal and made them more aware of the injustice of their situation. They argue passionately that the prohibition against teaching enslaved people to read is itself evidence of slavery's moral bankruptcy, that if the institution were truly benevolent or ordained by God, as its defenders claimed, enslavers would not need to keep their property ignorant and illiterate. They challenge audiences to imagine what it means to be forbidden from learning, to be punished for the crime of seeking knowledge, to be deliberately kept in darkness because education might lead to questioning the system that exploits you. Their father, Paul Edmondson, still enslaved on Hamilton's estate, hears reports of his daughter's liberation and their work with the abolitionist movement through the informal networks that connect enslaved and free black communities across vast distances. The news brings him both joy and renewed grief, happiness that Mary and Emily have escaped the fate he had feared for them, but sorrow that he and Millie remain in bondage,
that their other children remain scattered across the South, that the family that had tried to escape together remains fractured and separated. He continues his work on Hamilton's estate with the same quiet dignity that had characterized him before the escape attempt, but those who know him well can see the toll that years of grief and powerlessness have taken, the way his shoulders have begun to bow, the way his eyes have taken on a faraway quality, as if he is looking at something beyond the immediate reality of his bondage. Millie Edmondson, robbed of the children she had hoped to protect, finds solace in helping other enslaved women navigate the impossible challenges of motherhood under slavery, offering advice and support even as her own heart remains broken by the loss of her family. She becomes a kind of unofficial counselor, someone other enslaved mothers turn to when they need someone who understands the unique anguish of raising children you cannot protect, of loving people who can be taken from you at any moment, of trying to maintain hope in circumstances designed to crush all hope. Her strength becomes legendary among the enslaved community on Hamilton's estate and neighboring properties, her ability to carry on despite crushing loss, serving as an example of resilience that inspires others even as it masks the depth of her private suffering. Augustus, the elderly man who had hoped to die free, does not survive long after the failed escape attempt. His death comes quietly one night, his body simply giving up after 75 years of enduring what no human being should have to endure. His isolation in his final years ensuring that his passing is noted by few and mourned by those who remember him as a man who had dared to dream of freedom, even when that dream seemed impossible. He is buried in an unmarked grave in the section of the cemetery reserved for enslaved people, his life and death recorded nowhere in official documents, his story preserved only in the memories of those who knew him and in the oral traditions of the enslaved community that refuses to let such stories be completely erased. Sarah and her son remain in Mrs. Carlyle's household, their lives a testament to survival if not to freedom, their daily existence a navigation of constraints and compromises that define bondage in its domestic form. The boy grows up knowing his mother's story, understanding from an early age that his very existence is precarious, that the stability of their situation depends on his mother's continued compliance and Mrs. Carlyle's continued financial stability. Sarah teaches him to read in secret, passing on the same gift of literacy that had been given to her, understanding that education is both dangerous and necessary, that it might give him tools to eventually escape, even as it makes his bondage more psychologically unbearable. The other participants in the Pearl escape scatter across the South, their individual stories lost to history in most cases, preserved only in fragments and rumors that make their way back to the communities they left behind. Some are sold to plantations where they disappear into the brutal anonymity of cotton and sugar cultivation, their identities erased as they become simply units of labor measured by the amount of work they can produce. Others find themselves in urban settings as domestics or skilled workers, their situations perhaps slightly less physically brutal, but no less fundamentally unfree. A few manage to escape again, making their way north through the Underground Railroad, their second attempts at freedom informed by the lessons learned from the failure of the Pearl, their success serving as proof that the desire for freedom cannot be permanently suppressed, no matter how severe the punishment for seeking it. The passage of time slowly transforms the Pearl incident from current event to historical episode, but its impact continues to reverberate through the decades leading up to the Civil War. Each time the issue of slavery in the District of Columbia comes up for debate, the Pearl is mentioned, its story serving as a reminder of what is at stake in these abstract political discussions. Each time abolitionists need an example of slavery's cruelty and the desperation it creates, they turn to the story of the 77 who risked everything for a chance of freedom. Each time defenders of slavery argue that enslaved people are content with their condition, opponents cite the Pearl as evidence that this claim is nothing more than self-serving fantasy.
The final threads of the Pearl story weave themselves into the larger tapestry of American history, becoming inseparable from the narrative arc that leads inexorably towards civil war and eventual emancipation. When Abraham Lincoln takes office in 1861 and the nation splits apart over the question of slavery's expansion, the Pearl incident stands as one of countless examples of the fundamental incompatibility between the ideals America professes and the reality it has constructed, between the rhetoric of freedom that defines American identity and the brutal system of human bondage that has become economically and socially embedded in half the country. The 77 who attempted escape that April night in 1848 could not have known that their failed bid for freedom would become part of a larger story of national reckoning, that their individual suffering would eventually contribute to the momentum that makes emancipation possible. When the Civil War finally comes, it arrives with a violence that shocks even those who had predicted conflict, a bloodletting that claims over 600,000 lives, and transforms the nation in ways both intended and unintended. The enslaved people of the South, including those who had participated in escape attempts like the Pearl, recognize the war as the opportunity they have been waiting for, the moment when the system that has oppressed them begins to crack and crumble under its own contradictions. They flee to Union lines by the thousands, becoming contraband in the language of the time, forcing the federal government to confront the reality that this war cannot be only about preserving the Union, but must ultimately be about ending slavery if it is to have any meaning beyond mere political maneuvering. Paul and Millie Edmondson lived to see slavery abolished, their liberation coming not through purchase or individual escape, but through the sweeping transformation of the 13th Amendment that finally makes bondage illegal throughout the United States. The joy they feel at this liberation is tempered by the decades of suffering that preceded it, by the children they lost to the slave trade and may never see again, by the years they can never recover, and the experiences they can never undo. They spend their remaining years as free people, a status they had dreamed of but had almost stopped believing was possible, trying to locate their scattered children and rebuild some semblance of the family that the Pearl's failure had torn apart. Mary and Emily Edmondson, having gained their freedom years earlier through abolitionist fundraising, continue their work even after the war ends, understanding that legal freedom does not automatically translate into social equality or economic opportunity, that the racism that justified slavery does not simply disappear when the institution itself is abolished. They become educators, establishing schools for formerly enslaved people, teaching reading and writing and arithmetic to students who have been systematically denied education, working to build the infrastructure of freedom that the federal government is slow to provide. Their work is part of the broader effort of Reconstruction, that brief and ultimately betrayed moment when it seems like America might actually fulfill its promises of equality and justice for all its citizens regardless of race. The legacy of the Pearl extends beyond the individual participants into the collective memory of African Americans, becoming one of many stories of resistance that are passed down through generations, that serve as reminders of courage in the face of impossible odds, that testify to the unquenchable human desire for freedom and dignity. The story is told in churches and schools, in families and communities, preserved in oral tradition when official histories ignore or minimize it, kept alive by people who understand that remembering such stories is essential to understanding both the horror of what was endured and the strength of those who endured it. It becomes part of the larger narrative of Black resistance to slavery, taking its place alongside stories of rebellion and escape, of legal challenges and political organizing, of cultural preservation and community building under conditions designed to make all such efforts impossible. In our own time, the Pearl incident resonates with new urgency as we grapple with the ongoing legacy of slavery and the systems of racial oppression that evolved from it. The story reminds us that freedom is never granted freely by those who benefit from oppression, that it must be fought for even when the odds seem insurmountable, that failure in one moment does not negate the importance of the struggle itself. It challenges comfortable narratives about gradual progress and peaceful change, forcing us to confront the reality that fundamental transformation often requires people to risk everything, to defy unjust laws, to act according to moral imperatives even when legal systems are arrayed against them. The 77 people who boarded the Pearl that April night were ordinary individuals thrust into extraordinary circumstances, people whose names and stories have been largely forgotten by official history, but whose courage and determination deserve to be remembered and honored. They were mothers and fathers, children and grandparents, skilled workers and field laborers, people with dreams and fears and hopes and griefs, people who made a decision that the possibility of freedom was worth risking everything they had, including their lives and the lives of their families. Their attempt failed in the immediate sense. Their ship was captured and they were returned to bondage, many suffering fates worse than what they had fled. But their attempt also succeeded in ways they could not have anticipated, becoming part of the larger story of resistance that eventually made emancipation inevitable, proving that the system of slavery could not be maintained with constant violence and surveillance, inspiring others to continue the struggle even when success seemed impossible. As we reflect on their story more than a century and 3/4 later, we are reminded that the struggle for justice and equality is never finished, that each generation must decide whether it will accept the injustices of its time or work to transform them, that the comfortable option is rarely the right option when human dignity is at stake. The Pearl incident stands as both history and challenge, both memorial and call to action, asking us to honor the courage of those who came before by continuing their work in our own time, by refusing to accept systems of oppression as inevitable or permanent, by believing that change is possible even when it seems impossibly distant. This is their legacy,
and it is our responsibility to carry it forward.